A simple act of kindness returns to Julia in an unexpected way. Just when she needs a miracle the most, she gave her last bit of money to a hungry street child. But 12 years later, when Julia was having her worst day, a millionaire knocked on her door to surprise her. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The routine was the same every time. The clock struck 5 o'clock in the afternoon, signaling the end of the day's shifts for dozens of workers at a textile plant in Detroit. Julia was one of those employees who hurried down the same street after work to catch the bus back home. Because the work was so demanding, she was exhausted at times. On that day, the factory had received a large shipment of materials. Despite having machines to assist with the work, Julia still had to carry and move large rolls of fabric from one side of the factory to another. Her arms trembled from exertion, but the job was eventually completed. On days like this, Julia would catch the bus home and sleep for most of the ride. Julia's co-workers, who lived in the same neighborhood, were usually around to wake her up so she wouldn't miss her stop. However, she was left alone on the bus that particular day. If she fell asleep, she risked waking up too far from her destination, which could mean a long walk or wait. Worrying didn't help because Julia dozed off in her seat. However, a man's deep and gentle voice woke her up. "Excuse me, I think your bus stop is next, right?" Julia opened her eyes, puzzled by what was happening. "It's your stop, isn't it?" the man asked, lightly touching her shoulder. He apologized for startling her. "I didn't want you to miss your stop," he said. He was well-dressed with a calm demeanor, looking to be in his 30s. He spoke in a way that reassured her that he meant no harm. After thanking him, Julia inquired how he knew where she needed to get off. Julia was usually with her co-workers, who woke her up, but today she was alone, and the man had noticed. He introduced himself as David as they exited the bus. They began chatting as they walked down the street together. Julia lived a long way from David, but he decided to wait with her at the bus stop since she had to catch another bus to get home. The conversation flowed smoothly, and they quickly discovered they had similar tastes in music, shared interests in books, and even had mutual friends in the city. "How come we've never met before?" Julia asked, half joking. "Actually," David said with a bit of a laugh, "I've noticed you on this bus route a few times." The second bus arrived, and David bid her farewell, but not before they agreed to meet again the next day. They met 5 times that week, each meeting feeling easier and more natural than the previous ones. Within 3 weeks, they were dating. Their relationship was so strong and beautiful that within a year, David got down on one knee, presented Julia with a sparkling ring, and asked her to marry him. Julia, thrilled, accepted without hesitation. 3 months later, they stood at the altar, sealing their vows. David and Julia moved in together and went about their daily lives. David worked as a software developer for a growing tech company, while Julia continued working at the textile plant. Though her job was exhausting, her life had become much more fulfilling since meeting David. He would make dinner for her and massage her tired back and arms when she came home from long days at work. Life wasn't perfect, but it was far better than she had imagined it could be. Julia often thought she had won the lottery when she looked at the man sleeping next to her. This feeling only intensified a few years later when a pregnancy test revealed that they were expecting a new addition to their family. The couple eagerly awaited the arrival of their child, and when their daughter Emma was born, it felt like a dream come true. David was able to move his vacation up by a few weeks, so he could be with his wife and newborn during the precious early days. For them, holding baby Emma was like holding a piece of heaven. Emma was a beautiful, healthy baby who brought endless joy to her parents. As she grew and developed normally, David began to experience occasional headaches and chest pains. At first, they assumed it was stress from work, but the pain persisted even after they took a month-long family vacation. Julia became increasingly worried and urged David to see a doctor, fearing something serious like a heart condition. "David, please, you really should see a doctor. This isn't normal," Julia insisted one evening after he grimaced while playing with Emma. David waved it off with a smile. "It's probably just the long hours and stress. Maybe I need to start meditating or something. Don't worry, I'm too young for heart problems." Despite his casual dismissal, Julia's concern grew, especially when the pains didn't stop. David decided to start exercising more regularly, believing that light jogging might help. And for a while, it seemed to work. His pains would disappear for days at a time, only to resurface unexpectedly. Sometimes it would happen while they were watching TV, or worse, when he was playing with Emma. "David, this is serious," Julia said, her voice rising with concern after one particularly bad incident. "You need to see a doctor now." "I will, I promise. If it keeps happening, I'll go. I'm just dehydrated. That's all," David replied, trying to reassure her. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, David awoke with extreme dizziness and sharp pain in his chest. He tried to get out of bed, but he collapsed back onto the mattress with a groan, startling Julia and Emma, who was playing in the living room. "David!" Julia cried, rushing to his side. He clutched his chest, unable to speak. Panic set in, and Julia immediately called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors informed Julia that David had suffered the early stages of a brain aneurysm and was in critical condition. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and he had slipped into unconsciousness. The doctors couldn't say for certain what the outcome would be and needed to monitor him closely. Hours passed without change. Julia sat beside David's bed, her heart breaking as she held Emma close. "Where's Daddy?" Emma asked, her innocent eyes full of confusion. Julia forced a smile, trying to hold back tears. "Daddy's just resting, sweetheart. He'll be home soon, I promise." She wanted to believe those words. David was too young, too full of life to be facing something so severe. But the doctors weren't optimistic, and Julia could feel fear creeping in. Suddenly, there was an emergency at the hospital. Nurses rushed down the hall, and Julia's heart raced. Moments later, a doctor appeared, and the look on his face confirmed her worst fears. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "We did everything we could, but he had a second, more severe aneurysm." The words hit Julia like a punch in the gut. She couldn't breathe. David was gone. He had died from a second, far more intense rupture than the first. Julia fell to her knees, tears flowing uncontrollably. Emma, sensing her mother's distress, began to cry too. "Mommy, is Daddy not okay?" she asked in a tiny voice. Julia could only sob, unable to find the words to explain what had just happened. She held Emma tightly, wishing she could wake up from this nightmare. In the days following David's death, Julia had no choice but to carry on for Emma's sake. She returned to work at the textile factory, pushing through her grief as best she could. Life became a balancing act of managing her emotions and trying to be strong for her daughter. Her co-workers, aware of her loss, offered their support, but Julia rarely accepted help. She had to keep moving forward, even if it felt impossible. She took on extra hours at the factory to make ends meet, working late into the evening. The additional income helped, but it left her even more exhausted and with less time for Emma. Julia hated missing moments with her daughter, but she had no other options. She needed to provide for Emma, even if it meant sacrificing her own well-being. On her way into the bus station one chilly morning, a thin, pale girl collided with Julia. The child looked frail, her eyes wide with desperation. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm really sorry to bother you, but I haven't eaten since yesterday. Could you spare some change, please?" the girl asked, her voice trembling, as if she was embarrassed by her situation. Julia scanned the area, expecting to see a parent nearby, but the girl appeared to be alone. Everyone else in the station seemed oblivious to her presence, focused on their own lives. The girl rested her arms over her empty stomach, a gesture that broke Julia's heart. "Poor thing," Julia thought. "You must be starving." The scene tugged at Julia, who couldn't shake the image of her own daughter, Emma, being in such a situation. Without a second thought, Julia opened her wallet, finding only $20 and a few coins. She handed over the $20 along with the sandwich she had packed for her lunch. "Here, take this," Julia said softly. "I can go without today, but you shouldn't." The young girl looked at Julia with wide, grateful eyes, tears brimming. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll repay you, I promise." Julia smiled as the girl hurried away, clutching the money and sandwich as though they were treasures. Julia had no regrets, even though it meant she would go hungry that day. She spent the rest of the day hoping the girl was all right. The girl, now known as Megan, was living in a tough home environment. Her parents were struggling with addiction and rarely noticed their daughter's needs. Despite the odds stacked against her, Megan held on to the dream of a better life. She didn't know how she would get there, but she believed deep down that her circumstances wouldn't define her forever. 12 years passed, and while Megan's path was uncertain at the time, Julia's life continued at the textile plant. She had been promoted twice, and though the extra income helped, it didn't make life easier. The burden of balancing work, grief, and motherhood weighed heavily on her, especially as Emma grew older. Emma had become an energetic and adventurous young girl. On most afternoons, she could be found racing around the neighborhood on her roller skates with her friends. One day, in the middle of a playful race, Emma lost her balance, tripped on a crack in the asphalt, and tumbled hard onto the ground. She hit her head and back in the fall, and immediately her friends rushed over to check on her. Though she was conscious, she couldn't move. Bystanders called an ambulance, and Julia was notified while she was at work. The panic that had gripped her all those years ago when David was in the hospital returned in full force. She sped to the hospital, her heart in her throat, as she demanded answers from the nurses at the front desk. "Please tell me what's happening to my daughter. Is she going to be all right?" Julia asked, barely holding back tears. "Please calm down, ma'am," the nurse said gently. "Your daughter is stable, but the doctor is on his way to explain everything." Julia's fear only worsened. She couldn't bear the thought of another hospital tragedy after what had happened to David. The doctor soon arrived and took Julia aside to break the news. "Mrs. Harris, Emma sustained serious injuries to her spine during the fall," the doctor explained carefully. "It's likely that she won't be able to walk again." The words hit Julia like a hammer. Her knees nearly gave out as she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I must be cursed," she cried. The doctor spoke calmly, trying to reassure her. "All is not lost. There are surgeons who specialize in spinal reconstruction. Emma could walk again one day, but the treatments are extremely expensive, likely in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars." Julia's heart sank further. She couldn't afford such a high cost, even if she sold everything she owned. "Even if I sell our apartment, we'll be homeless and still not have enough to pay for a surgery like that," Julia said, her voice breaking with despair. The doctor lowered his eyes, knowing she was right. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Julia had ever faced. Emma was eventually discharged from the hospital, confined to a wheelchair. The medical bills alone were overwhelming, and despite Julia's tireless efforts, they couldn't afford the advanced care that Emma desperately needed. Julia's determination never wavered, though. She launched a fundraising campaign online, pleading with others to help her daughter regain her mobility. Though the campaign gained some attention on social media, it didn't bring in nearly enough money to cover the surgery. It felt like the future was slipping away from them, no matter how hard Julia fought to save it. But unbeknownst to Julia, one of her past acts of kindness was about to change everything. On the morning of August 15th, 2019, just when Julia had nearly lost all hope, there was a knock at her door. Confused and expecting nothing more than a delivery, she opened it to find a young woman standing in front of her. The woman was elegantly dressed, and behind her in the driveway sat a luxurious car. Julia's initial confusion deepened as she tried to place the stranger's face. "Hello," the woman said, smiling warmly. "I doubt you'll recognize me, but I made a promise to you many years ago." Julia stared, searching her memory. The woman then reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and handed it to Julia. At that moment, everything clicked. Julia's eyes widened as she finally realized who the woman was. The scared, hungry, and pale girl she had helped so long ago had grown into this confident, successful woman. Megan beamed, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I promised I'd repay you one day," she said, her voice soft. Julia was overwhelmed, tears welling in her eyes. She stepped forward, embracing Megan tightly before inviting her inside. Megan explained that she had never forgotten the kindness Julia had shown her all those years ago on the bus. "I was at one of the lowest points in my life that day," Megan admitted. "Your $20 and that sandwich made a huge difference to me. You may not know it, but it was a turning point. I promised myself I'd find you and thank you when I had the chance." As they talked, Julia felt immense relief knowing that Megan had come through such hardship to become a strong, capable woman. Megan shared how she had risen from the streets, fought through adversity, and eventually became a successful financial advisor. It wasn't an easy journey, but she had persevered, always keeping that moment of kindness in her heart. Just as they were catching up, Emma entered the room in her wheelchair. Megan's eyes immediately landed on her, and it was clear that she was concerned. She hadn't expected to see Julia's daughter like this. Megan then revealed that she had found Julia through the online fundraiser for Emma's surgery. "I recognized you as soon as I saw the picture on your fundraising page," Megan explained, "and I knew I had to come here and help." Julia, touched by Megan's words, tried to explain how difficult things had become. "I appreciate anything you can do, but we need $250,000 for Emma's surgery, and even with the fundraiser, we're nowhere near that amount. I'm afraid we'll need years to raise the rest." Megan smiled kindly and took Julia's hands in hers. "You won't need any more donations," she said, her voice filled with reassurance. "I'll cover everything." Julia stood frozen, trying to process what Megan had just said. Could this be real? The thought that her daughter might finally get the surgery she so desperately needed brought a flood of emotions rushing in. Tears spilled down Julia's face as she realized the weight of Megan's generosity. Emma, too, was silent, her young mind grappling with the possibility that she might walk again. Was it truly happening? Could this stranger, who was once a girl Julia had helped on a whim, really be offering them such a miracle? Megan stayed with them for the rest of the day, listening to their stories and assuring both mother and daughter that they should never lose hope. She made it clear that she believed in giving back to those who had helped her, and that Julia had done so much more than she ever realized by simply offering her a bit of kindness all those years ago. Within weeks, Megan had arranged for Emma to undergo the necessary tests and treatment. The surgery took place at a specialized medical center in Chicago, and the entire process garnered attention from the media. Reporters covered Emma's story, focusing on her incredible journey and the life-changing assistance that Megan had provided. The community watched closely as Emma underwent months of recovery and grueling physical therapy. The road to recovery was painful for Emma. Physical therapy sessions pushed her to her limits, but she persevered with a strength that amazed Julia. Slowly but surely, Emma began to regain her mobility. With each small step, her body learned to walk again. 9 months after the surgery, Emma took her first steps without assistance. Julia watched in disbelief, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Megan was there too, holding Julia's hand as Emma walked with confidence and determination. "It's a miracle," Julia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe this is happening." Emma, once bound to her wheelchair, was now walking steadily, her movements filled with purpose. It felt like a dream, one that Julia had almost lost hope of ever seeing come true. And it all stemmed from a simple act of kindness, a moment that Julia had never imagined would return to her in such a profound way. Julia often thought of David during these moments, and though he wasn't there to witness it, she liked to believe that somehow he too was watching over them, proud of how far they had come. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.